Legend held that the range was formed when great dragons of the past battled for territorial rights in death matches that lasted for centuries. One of these noble beasts was Sardak, who was said to have come from the west. He fought with a mighty beast from the south. At Sardak's passing, his body fell to the earth, which encompassed his husk in stone, and set the largest and most northern hump in the central range's long, winding back. It was to the north of Sardak that the men intended to take, and they made sure to keep the peak to their left as they approached the range. By dusk, the men felt unnaturally tired. The track wasn't arduous, but all murmured together about achy joints and sore limbs as they set up camp for the night. In the foothills below the peaks, the lands became much more rock than dirt, and the company found a cliff ledge for natural cover. A fire was built, and Olin took up the first watch. The others were asleep within minutes, and Olin had the feeling that this was going to be a long watch. The forest cut down on the wind exposure, even at such high elevations, but the trees had wholly lost their leaves, and the lack of volume created opportunity for howling through the branches. Olin took comfort in the fact that the fallen leaves should provide additional security against approaching wanderers. He spent the time thinking of home. His mother had always been harping about the land, the good earth, and the grace of spirits, but Olin was always too interested in games and girls to hear much of it. When the games became petty, the girls turned into women, Olin had seen the army as an adventure to drown out the responsibility he'd be ignoring from mother. Military life had been fun for a time. The life was pretty easy once you figured out who could be ignored and who had to be listened to. The uniform certainly made the company easier to come by, and Olin liked to be the center of attention. Out here was different, though. Traveling with Gregor and Justus didn't feel like army to Olin. The army was decorations and pageantry. It was grown-up kids playing with sharper toy swords. But to Gregor, Olin believed the captain thought that the army was duty and honor. These last few days, Olin overheard him talking about virtue and truth. This life of a soldier was more to Gregor than it had ever been to Olin, which scared him, because it was all that Olin had. Even more confusing was Weston. The old goat seemed to be more like Borden and himself when within their company, but another man entirely when conversing with the captain and the tracker. Was it the captain that brought that out in him? Or was Olin truly the lost sheep in the group? Up until now, Olin had known what life was, a ripe apple for plunder. Now he felt that he saw the other side, the farmer that plants the apple he knows he will not eat, and found himself wondering if it was sweeter. A beam of light pierced through the crack in the tree line and struck Olin with all the force of truth. A quick check of the stars, and Olin realized that his watch was up, which was a little disconcerting, too quick to his liking. That usually meant he had fallen asleep somewhere in there, and while that normally didn't bother him, he felt ashamed, as if he had let Gregor down. He got up and moved over to Borden's sleeping frame. He gently knelt down and pushed Borden's shoulder until he opened his eyes. "Your turn," he whispered, and he started to roll his pack for a pillow. As Borden lifted himself, Olin thought he heard a shuffle off to their right. He immediately threw the thought away on account that it was obviously Borden moving, until he realized that Borden was on his left. Olin stiffened his back and gave a weary glance toward Borden, who was strapping on his scabbard. Borden gave no notice of hearing the shuffle, and Olin let this work complacency within him. He unbelted his own sword and pulled the combat knife from its sheath. Placing the knife close to his right hand, Olin laid down for the night. As he peered out into the darkness below, he couldn't shake the rustling. He decided to focus on a single point in the horizon and closed his eyes as small as possible without losing the point. With the fire to his back, Olin's vision quickly acclimatized to the dark. The point was a bush of some sort, not more than 20 yards from their position. Olin's vigil lasted a good couple minutes before deciding he was fooling himself. As he closed his eyes for real, two things happened almost simultaneously. He thought he saw the bush move, or at least something move in front of the bush, and he heard a very audible whistle. So audible that he instinctively bolted upright and turned to face Borden. Borden had heard it as well, and took a pace toward the noise. His face grew grave, and he pulled his sword as he shouted in the direction of the camp. "Up!" The three men asleep were uncharacteristically slow to move, and Olin felt like the scene played out in some sort of magical fashion, as if it was time that was moving slower instead of those present within it. The things, were they children? That came into the light did so at a snail's pace. Even slower, though, appeared to be the flames of the fire as Olin watched Weston practically grumble his body into an upright position with no weapon in hand. It reminded Olin of watching a toddler wake from a silly dream and not really understanding he had returned to reality. Even Olin's own draw on his combat knife felt forced, and he realized he couldn't tell if he was standing or sitting, really. It didn't matter one way or the other because the company was clearly outmatched.